So it's a pleasure to be here this morning in such esteemed company, but especially can I say welcome to the undergrads in the room. Some of the challenges we're going to talk about today are yours and mine to solve over the next few years. So please give us all of your questions. I'm going to try and be brief so that we have some time to get to those. So I'd love to hear them. What I want to cover off on today are some initial thoughts on where we are in a military and geopolitical context and how we got here, the direction that some of those loud voices that Stephen talked about are moving in, because like it or not, they are the loud voices, and highlight some of the tools that we might think about as we decide what being a responsible space player looks like for Australia, and sort of move forwards in that direction that Megan touched on this morning. So Her Excellency the Governor mentioned this morning that space is becoming more militarised, and since the motto of the Royal Society is to question everything, I sort of wanted to think about that. Is space more militarised? There's certainly more military stuff in space, but there's a lot more of everything in space today than there was 50 years ago. So this quote here wouldn't have been out of place 2 weeks ago in Mike Pence's speech at the International Astronautics Congress. But it's actually a little bit older than that. And Kerry sort of highlighted some of the roots of different countries' space programs and humanity's progress in space sort of stems from a lot of strategic competition and from defence purposes. And James Doolittle was one of the earliest thinkers on that topic back in 1959. But I think it's important to consider that rhetoric wouldn't be out of place today. So I'm not sure if space is more militarised today or if space is just bigger. It's always been a place for strategic competition between nations since Sputnik, which is the first spacecraft. That was an element of strategic competition between the great powers of the time. And as the commercial ecosystem in space has grown, public knowledge around what happens in that domain and what's going on there has grown. So I think we're more conscious today of some of the military and geopolitical aspects of the space domain. And strategic competition has upsides. We wouldn't have some of the technologies we have today, like GPS or some of the Earth observation technologies that we have, without those technologies first finding a purpose in defence and strategic competition. If we didn't have Earth observation, we wouldn't have found out about climate change. So some things to think about there. A few people have sort of touched on strategy and what it means to be strategic. And what I'm going to talk about in a couple of slides' time is what that looks like for some of the major powers. But first, I think it's important to talk about what strategy actually is. Because as you can see on the slide, it's not about winning. It's about attaining continuous advantage. And when we see something like space, which is a limited resource, we often see competition for that resource between different groups of people. So it's important to remember that we're not talking about a particular end state, we're talking about planning for continuous advantage. And we're going to talk about what that means to a few different countries in a minute. So as I sort of touched on before, we heard some rhetoric that most of you, I hope, will be familiar with from the Vice President of the United States 2 weeks ago. And I think that what Space Command said is sort of a little bit more moderate in terms of their outlook. But there's a range of opinions in the United States, from an America first sort of point of view to a more moderate point of view that recognises the importance of space to all of those national enterprises, to a realm for competition between the United States and other great powers. So I think that quote's really powerful in sort of being a 2019 version of what General Doolittle was talking about back in the 50s. The idea of Space Force is not as new as Donald Trump. That idea sort of has its genesis in some lawmakers in the United States before he was thought of, from some people who were unhappy with how the US Air Force managed space capability development. Mike Pence has directed NASA to return to the moon by 2024, and some of the people that I've spoken to in NASA see that time frame as a bit challenging. To wrap all that together, at IAC we sort of saw a real tension between different parts of the American leadership, between what American dominance looks like and what role there is for international partners in the role for the United States in space. Jim Bridenstine, the NASA administrator, every time I saw him spoke about the importance of international partnerships. So I think there's a real lesson there that's peculiar to the United States in terms of what people at the working level think about international collaboration. Russia's another country that's reorganised its defence apparatus to better leverage the space domain. You can see a couple of quotes there from Russian military doctrine that's a little bit long in the tooth now, and some more recent comments from the defence minister. So they've sort of gone the opposite direction from a space force. They've wrapped some of their space elements up with some other air defence assets because they see some synergies there that are going to help them better secure space for Russia. And I think it's important to highlight there that the Russian military sees warfare as a contest for information over a number of domains, without often clear boundaries, which is a little bit different to speaking about space as a warfighting domain. So there are some differences in approach there between Russia and the United States that you can start to see in how they're organising for best effect. So when we talk about whether Space Force is a good thing, whether it's ethical, what the implications are there, I think it's important to remember that there are other ways of organising that are maybe not so bombastic that we need to give equal consideration to. Finally, China. Chinese strategic writing emphasises that space is essential to operating in the other domains. And this same report from US Air Force Space Command is explicit about calling out China and their long-term strategy for displacing the United States. So the Chinese Academy of Military Sciences talks about fighting a quick war as one of the characteristics of space operations. And they see that as essential to their ability to deter their adversaries geopolitically. The People's Liberation Army, of course, has organised a strategic support force that wraps up space, cyber and electronic warfare capabilities in the People's Liberation Army. So it's a third, different again, example of a military space organisation. So I'll leave you with this slide where I'm going to talk about some of the actual tools and systems that give Stephen and I pause when we think about what people can do in space. Space domain awareness on the left-hand side does what it says on the tin. That's understanding what's happening in space, where spacecraft are, what they're doing. Without that, you can't achieve any of those other effects if space turns into a warfighting domain that you can see over on the right-hand side. So the first thing I want to talk about there is cyber attacks. I'm not a cyber expert, but I don't think it's news to anyone that spacecraft and ground stations are vulnerable to cyber effects. The second thing is a sort of spectrum from radio frequency jamming to directed energy weapons. So we see in the public domain that the Defence Intelligence Agency commented this year on some Chinese satellite communications jammers over a range of frequency bands. And it won't be news to any of you that those are frequency bands that are pretty commonly used across the military and civilian sectors. We also see from the Defence Intelligence Agency that GPS jammers have been deployed in the Spratly Islands, and the Chinese have published scientific papers on laser blinding techniques and successfully did that against one of their own satellites in 2013. So that brings me to our second point. There's another spectrum there between laser dazzling and laser blinding that sort of goes to this. I should have explained this slide a little bit better. We're talking about a spectrum from reversible to non-reversible effects here. So the same laser that you can use at a lower power setting to dazzle a satellite, you can amp up the power and burn out the CCD. Finally, I want to talk about rendezvous and proximity operations. That bleeds into space domain awareness because all three of those countries I just talked about have demonstrated a rendezvous and proximity operations program. So that's about driving satellites around in orbit to go and check out other satellites and see what they're doing. Number of applications for that, from intelligence to verifying arms control treaties, to removing debris in space. Having that capability is essential to all of those things, and not all of those are military purposes. The two final points on that slide are about co-orbital anti-satellite weapons and direct descent anti-satellite weapons. So if you can do rendezvous and proximity operations, there's no reason you can't put bombs on satellites and drive them around in orbit. Ditto, we've seen direct descent ASAT tests from most recently India, but also China, Russia, and the United States. And if anyone's looking for more information on any of those things, those two reports there from the Centre for Strategic and Independent Studies and our friends at the Secure World Foundation are excellent resources to get more in the weeds about that. With that, I'm going to finish and keep us on time. Thank you.